You're standing on a frozen riverbank 40,000 years ago, and your feet are bare. The ice under you isn't soft, it's a blade. Every step is a negotiation with pain, and you've stopped feeling your toes an hour ago, which should terrify you more than it does. There's no fire waiting nearby, there's no shelter in sight. There's no one coming to carry you. There's just the ground, and your skin against it, and the slow arithmetic of how much longer a human body can survive like this before the tissue starts to die. This is the problem your ancestors had to solve, not once, not in one place, but over and over, across tens of thousands of years, on nearly every continent humans ever walked into. And the question this video is actually asking isn't when did shoes get invented? It's stranger than that. It's why did it take so long? Why did a species smart enough to control fire, track migrating herds, and paint animals on cave walls in flickering torchlight take, by some estimates, over 100,000 years to figure out that wrapping something around its feet might help? Here's the thing nobody tells you. Shoes weren't invented, not in the way we think of invention, like a light bulb moment, one clever person solving one clear problem. Footwear crept into human life sideways, accidentally, through trial and error spread across dozens of unconnected populations who never spoke to each other, using whatever materials happened to be lying around. Bark, grass, hide, wood. The story of the shoe isn't a story of genius, it's a story of desperation repeating itself in 1,000 different climates until it finally stuck. And here's where it gets even stranger. We don't actually have the first shoe. Nobody does. Leather rots, woven grass disintegrates, bark fiber turns to dust within a few centuries in most soil conditions. So everything we think we know about the earliest footwear is a kind of forensic guesswork, built not from the shoes themselves, but from the bones of the people who might have worn them. That's where the story really begins, not with a shoe, with a foot. In 2005, a researcher named Eric Trinkhaus, an anthropologist who spent decades studying the skeletal structure of ancient humans, noticed something odd while examining foot bones from sites across Europe and Asia. Specifically, he was looking at the toes. Modern humans who go barefoot their whole lives, and there are still populations today who do, tend to develop thick, robust toe bones. The stress of walking unprotected builds them up, the same way a bare hand develops calluses. But somewhere between roughly 40,000 and 26,000 years ago, in multiple populations, human toe bones start getting noticeably thinner and more gracile, weaker in a purely mechanical sense. At first, that sounds like bad news. A species getting physically weaker should be a red flag. But Trinkhaus proposed the opposite explanation, and it's the one that's largely held up. Thinner toe bones don't mean weaker feet, they mean protected feet. When you stop grinding your toes directly into rock, ice, and thorny undergrowth, they stop needing to be reinforced. The bone thins because the skin isn't taking direct impact anymore. Something is absorbing the load instead of the foot doing it alone. That something was almost certainly some early crude form of footwear. Not a boot, probably not even something we'd recognize as a shoe. Possibly just a wrapped hide, tied at the ankle with a length of sinew, good for 1 or 2 uses before it wore through and had to be replaced. This is the first proof drop of the story, and it's a strange one, because the evidence for the earliest shoe isn't a shoe, it's an absence. It's a bone that got quieter over time. Scientists reconstructed one of the most transformative technologies in human history by reading what stopped happening to a piece of skeleton. Let's sit with that for a second, because it says something important about how most of human innovation actually works. We like to imagine our ancestors having flashes of insight, someone sitting by a fire going, "Eureka, I shall invent the shoe." That's not what happened. What happened was closer to this. A hide wrapped around a foot for warmth on a freezing night, left on the next morning out of laziness, and then noticed weeks later to have prevented a cut, a blister, or a case of frostbite that would have killed a hunter's ability to walk, and therefore his ability to eat. Nobody invented the shoe. Necessity just kept quietly rewarding the people who happened to wrap their feet and punishing the people who didn't, until wrapping your feet became something everyone did without needing to be told why. And this is where the timeline actually gets interesting, because if Trinkaus's toe bone evidence holds, it pushes footwear back farther than almost anyone assumed for the most of the 20th century. For decades, the oldest confirmed physical shoe remains came from sites like Fort Rock Cave in Oregon, sagebrush bark sandals radiocarbon dated to roughly 10,000 years old, or the famous Arini I-1 leather shoe found in a cave in Armenia, preserved almost perfectly at around 5,500 years old because the cave sealed it in dry, oxygen-poor sediment for millennia. Those are real shoes, intact, undeniable. But the bone evidence suggests something wrapped around human feet as far back as 40,000 years, maybe more, decades or even centuries before anyone thought to draw a shoe on a cave wall or leave one buried in a grave. Which means the shoe, as a piece of human technology, might be older than agriculture, older than pottery, older quite possibly than most of the language structures we'd recognize as complex speech. It might be older than almost anything we consider a hallmark of civilization, hiding the entire time not in a museum case, but in the quiet architecture of a toe bone that simply stopped needing to be strong. Let's talk about what these early wrappings were actually made of, because the answer depends entirely on where in the world you were standing. In colder, northern climates, the material of choice was hide, and specifically, it was often not tanned leather in the way we'd think of it today, but raw hide, sometimes still partially furred, wrapped and laced with sinew or plant cordage. Researchers studying indigenous Arctic footwear traditions, including the mukluk designs still used by Inuit communities today, point out that these weren't crude improvisations. They were engineered systems. Multiple layers, an inner boot of soft tanned skin for warmth, an outer layer of tougher hide for waterproofing, and often a layer of dried grass stuffed between them for insulation, a technique so effective that some Arctic explorers in the 19th century abandoned their manufactured boots entirely in favor of copying it. That's the proof drop worth sitting with. European expeditions, backed by industrial manufacturing, steel needles, wool mills, entire supply chains, routinely lost toes and feet to frostbite in Arctic conditions. Meanwhile, populations using grass-stuffed hide boots, a technology with no metal, no factories, and no written instructions passed down anything but generation to generation by hand, walked across the same ice with their feet intact. Technology in this story doesn't mean more advanced materials. It means better solved for the actual problem. And for tens of thousands of years, the people solving the problem best were the ones with the least writing about how they did it. Necessity doesn't care how impressive your tools look. It only cares if you keep your toes. In warmer, drier climates, the material shifts completely. Bark, woven brass, and plant fiber sandals show up independently in the archaeological record across wildly separated regions: ancient Egypt, the deserts of the American Southwest, coastal populations in what's now Australia, all developing strikingly similar flat woven sole designs without any contact with one another. That's not coincidence, that's convergent evolution, the same phenomenon that gives sharks and dolphins similar body shapes despite one being a fish and one being a mammal. When the problem is identical, unrelated groups of humans tend to land on similar solutions because there are only so many ways to solve how do I put something flat and durable between my foot and the ground. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because sandals didn't stay simple for long. In ancient Egypt, footwear stopped being purely practical almost immediately and became a status marker, sometimes a genuinely coded one. Archaeologists examining tomb paintings and burial goods, including sandals found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, note that specific sandal designs, materials, and even decorative motifs were restricted by class and role. Papyrus sandals for laborers, elaborately gilded, jeweled versions for royalty, some clearly never meant to touch actual ground, buried purely as symbolic objects for the afterlife. That's a strange twist worth pausing on. Shoes started as pure survival technology, something between you and a frozen or thorn-covered ground. Within a few thousand years, in at least one civilization, some of them had transformed into objects too precious to walk in at all.
There's another angle to this that rarely comes up, and it's about status, but not the kind involving gold. In several ancient societies, going barefoot or wearing basic footwear wasn't just a practical default, it was often a deliberate marker of humility, servitude, or piety. Roman senators and Egyptian priests at specific ritual moments would remove their sandals entirely, a gesture echoed in religious traditions that survive today, from the removal of shoes before entering a mosque to the barefoot walk still practiced in some Hindu and Jain temple traditions. The presence or absence of a shoe on a human foot became one of the oldest, most universal pieces of nonverbal social language our species ever developed. Long before anyone could read, everyone could read a foot. Here's the dark joke buried in all of this. Somewhere around 3,000 years ago, humans figured out how to signal wealth, power, and religious devotion using the exact same body part that spent the previous 100,000 years mostly just trying to not get frostbite or bitten by a scorpion. We took the single most abused, neglected, overworked part of the ancient human body and turned it into a canvas for status. Your feet went from the thing that almost kills you to the thing that proves you've made it in roughly the blink of an evolutionary eye. There's a 2015 study published in Archaeological Footwear Research examining sandal remains from Spirit Cave in Nevada, dated to roughly 10,000 years old, some of the oldest directly preserved footwear in North America, made of woven sagebrush bark, showing something else worth noting. The construction wasn't primitive. The weave pattern is deliberate, tight, clearly refined through repetition, meaning whoever made it wasn't improvising for the first time. They were following a technique. A technique implies teaching. Teaching implies that footwear making by 10,000 years ago was already an established craft passed between people, not a one-off survival hack reinvented from scratch every generation. That's the real turning point in this chapter of the story. At some point, footwear stopped being something an individual figured out to survive one bad winter and became something a community taught its children, deliberately, as knowledge worth preserving. The moment a technology gets taught on purpose is the moment it stops being luck.
Let's tackle the biggest myth about the invention of shoes, which is the idea that footwear made human feet weaker, softer, more dependent, and that somewhere back in deep prehistory, our ancestors had better, tougher feet than we do now before shoes supposedly ruined them. That's mostly backwards. It's not that shoes weakened feet, it's that shoes changed what feet needed to be strong for. Here's the deeper mechanism. A barefoot foot walking on natural, varied terrain, dirt, roots, uneven rock, develops what researchers studying barefoot biomechanics, including work associated with evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard, describe as broad-based strength. The muscles of the arch, the connective tissue, the toe splay, all get engaged constantly because the ground itself is unpredictable and the foot has to adapt to it in real time, step by step. Put a rigid, cushioned sole between that foot and the ground, and a lot of that constant micro-adaptation simply stops being necessary. The foot doesn't get worse, it specializes differently. It's not weakness, it's redirection. That's not degeneration, that's the body doing exactly what it's built to do, stop maintaining what it no longer needs. Lieberman's research, particularly his well-known studies comparing barefoot and shod running populations, found something that genuinely surprised a lot of people when it came out. Habitually barefoot runners tend to land differently, striking the ground with the middle or front of the foot rather than the heel, a pattern that reduces certain kinds of impact force the shoe is then relied upon to absorb. Neither pattern is objectively wrong, but it does mean that a piece of technology invented to protect the foot from the ground ended up quietly reshaping how tens of millions of people move, without most of them ever realizing their gait itself is, in a sense, a manufactured habit. Now for the stat stack, because this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable.
Modern podiatric research estimates that somewhere around 70 to 80% of people in industrialized, shoe-wearing societies will experience some form of foot pain or foot deformity, from bunions to plantar fasciitis to hammer toe, at some point in their adult lives. Compare that to studies of populations that remain habitually barefoot or minimally shod into adulthood, where researchers have repeatedly found dramatically lower rates of those same conditions, some studies citing rates in the single digits for issues like bunions. That's not a small gap. That's close to an order of magnitude difference, and it's one of the more inconvenient findings in modern footwear research, because it suggests that a huge percentage of foot problems in the developed world aren't inevitable byproducts of aging or genetics. They're byproducts of design choices, specifically narrow toe boxes and rigid, unnaturally shaped soles that became industry standard for reasons that had far more to do with manufacturing efficiency and fashion than with anatomy. So the myth isn't just wrong, it's almost exactly inverted. Shoes didn't make our feet weak. Certain kinds of shoes, mass-produced under industrial constraints rather than shaped around the actual biomechanics of a human foot, made our feet worse at doing what evolution spent millions of years optimizing them to do. There are real exceptions here worth naming, because this isn't a simple story of barefoot good, shoes bad. In 1938, a study conducted in China found declining rates of a specific foot deformity linked to the abandonment of foot binding, an extreme, deliberately harmful practice that isn't representative of normal footwear at all, but is worth mentioning because it shows the other end of the spectrum, cases where a covering placed on the foot wasn't protective technology, but active, sustained mutilation, carried out for status and marriageability reasons over nearly 1,000 years of Chinese history before being formally banned in the early 20th century. And there's the well-documented case of trench foot during the First World War, where standard-issue military boots, combined with days spent standing in cold water without the ability to dry out, caused tissue damage in hundreds of thousands of soldiers. A reminder that even well-made footwear can become dangerous the moment it's paired with conditions it wasn't designed to handle. Even Ötzi, the mummified man discovered frozen in the Alps in 1991 and dated to roughly 5,300 years ago, gives us a case study in nuance. His shoes, when analyzed by researchers, turned out to be remarkably sophisticated for their age, made of deer-hide uppers, bearskin soles, and an inner netting of tree bark that held in dry grass for insulation. Essentially the same layered, engineered logic used in Arctic footwear thousands of years later and thousands of miles away. And yet, Ötzi still died in the mountains, apparently from an arrow wound rather than exposure, a reminder that even the best footwear technology of its era couldn't protect against every threat the ancient world had waiting for you. We don't know exactly how many times footwear was independently invented and lost again across human history, and we probably never will. Perishable materials don't wait around for archaeologists.
Here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part. Let's be honest about something. The shoe that started as a piece of wrapped hide keeping a hunter's toes from dying on a frozen riverbank 40,000 years ago has become, in its modern industrial form, one of the more quietly exploitative supply chains on the planet. The global footwear industry produces an estimated over 20 billion pairs of shoes every year, the overwhelming majority manufactured in factories across South and Southeast Asia, often under labor conditions that investigative reporting and labor rights organizations have repeatedly linked to poverty wages, excessive overtime, and unsafe working environments. The technology that once meant the difference between a hunter walking home or losing his feet to frostbite now exists for a huge share of its global production inside a system where the people making it can least afford to buy it. There's a through line here that's hard to look away from once you see it. For most of human history, footwear was made by the person who was going to wear it, or by someone in their immediate community who understood exactly what ground that foot was going to walk on, the maker and the wearer bound by shared consequence. Held for roughly 99% of the time humans have been wearing shoes at all. It's only in the last century, an eye blink by comparison, that the maker and the wearer became strangers to each other, separated by oceans, currencies, and supply chains, with no shared stake in the outcome at all. And there's a second through line, quieter but just as strange. Remember the Egyptian sandals, the ones too precious to ever touch actual ground, buried in a tomb as pure symbol? That impulse never went away, it just changed shape. Walk past a shoe store today and you'll find limited releases, some resold for thousands of dollars, never worn, kept in boxes, photographed rather than laced up. We're still doing exactly what ancient Egyptian elites were doing 3,000 years ago, turning the most practical object a human being owns into a symbol precious enough to remove from practical use altogether. The material changed, bark and gilded leather became foam and synthetic mesh. The impulse, wanting your feet to say something about who you are, didn't move an inch. Somewhere between the frozen riverbank and the shoebox nobody ever opens, the entire story of human footwear compresses into a single strange arc: survival, then status, then spectacle, with the original purpose, the thing that started it all, quietly becoming almost an afterthought. So think about the shoes on your feet right now, or the ones sitting by your door. Somewhere in the design lineage of that object, however many layers of foam and rubber and marketing sit between you and it, there's a hide wrapped around a foot on a night cold enough to kill, tied off with a length of sinew by someone who had no idea they were starting anything at all. They weren't trying to invent a global industry. They weren't trying to create a status symbol or a supply chain or a multi-billion-dollar market. They were just trying to survive one more freezing night and to still have working feet in the morning. You're not wearing a product. You're wearing the end of a 100,000-year argument between the human body and the ground it walks on, and the ground still hasn't fully lost.